Charles here. Let's do a real quick loanable funds graph. We're just going to kind of run through this fairly quickly. Loanable funds sort of touches all over the place: monetary policy, fiscal policy, and then they kind of throw different things at you, foreign exchange. So we kind of can do this fairly quickly. Let's start off with one of the more easy sort of understandings here is private savings either increase or decrease for whatever reason. Well, first let's just draw the graph, make sure we know how to draw it. It is a supply of loanable funds that's upward sloping and a demand for loanable funds that is downward sloping. We have real interest rates on the vertical, quantity of loanable funds on the horizontal, quantity of loanable funds. This is your loanable funds graph, obviously. But the way I want you to think about this is it's money in the banks. That's how we're thinking of our loanable funds. Money in the banks. So for 2022, set one, they want to show if there's an increase in private savings. Well, if there's an increase in private savings, it implies people are putting more money in the banks. So your supply of loanable funds is going to shift to the right. There's more money going into the banks as people save for retirement or they increase their savings. Therefore, this is going to drive down the real interest rates. More money in the banks tends to make the interest rate, which is the price of money, fall. This should make sense. Obviously, quantity of loanable funds, we're going to show increasing here. Let's just do QLF 1 and 2. There's our correctly labeled graph. Now we're just going to blow through these because they're all really the same thing, but you can see that it's been tested a lot, so you should know this understanding here. In Econoland, they increased their savings for retirement. More money in the banks means a lower real interest rate. 2018, Ucheland reduces the tax rate on household interest earnings. That is a strange question. But if the government reduces taxes on, well, let's just call them savings, then we could assume that there's going to be more savings. If they're reducing the taxes on what you save, you'll probably save more. That's the understanding. Assume there's an increase in the country's national savings. Well, more money in the banks. Assume that personal savings in the U.S. increases. You see what's going on here. Tax rates on interest income from household savings is lowered. That's a bit of a clearer example than this one up here, but we should understand that those are really the two things, same things going on. Households increase savings for retirement. The economy is in a recession, yada, yada. The government implements a special tax incentive to encourage individuals to increase saving for retirement. National savings increases. The government replaces now this one's a little weird here. This is a very old question, right? So I don't know that we'd see anything like this again, but the government replaces the tax income with a sales tax that generates the same revenue. What is the effect of the change in tax policy on national savings? Well, again, the idea here is if they're not taxing income anymore, they're only taxing a sales tax, meaning that you have to buy something or consume something before you would actually be taxed. So if consumption is taxed, well, guess what's going to increase? There's only one thing you can do with a dollar. You can either spend it or you can save it. In this instance, consumption would go down, and we can be pretty sure that savings would go up, and we're back to our same understanding of a supply of loanable funds increasing. You should just recognize here that anytime real interest rates, for some reason this seems to slip by, if interest rates are going down, investment is people taking out loans to produce capital goods, factories, tools, equipment, whatever. So my question to you would be, would you rather borrow money at 20% or 2%? And if you said 2%, well, so would everybody else. So when real interest rates go down, we know investment has to go up. More people are going to be willing to borrow. In this situation, we're always talking about borrowing money when we're talking about investment. So understand that. Interest rates go down, investment has to go up. So there's all our private savings. Let's talk about fiscal policy, which is that government spending or taxes, and see if we can make sense of it here. We've got a little cheat sheet going on here. And if we have expansionary fiscal policy, which you and I should know is used mainly when we're in a recession. There's our long run aggregate supply, our short run aggregate supply. Here we are with our aggregate demand to the left of full employment. There's our price level. There's our real GDP. We're in a recession, and the government wants to spend money to get us out of this recession. They could also lower taxes. These are going to do the same thing. If they lower taxes, they're taking in less taxes, which means they're probably going to have to spend more money to get us out of this recession. We're going to shorten the understanding here and understand that the government's going to borrow. And we're going to say, because they never take in enough taxes to cover their government spending, especially if they're lowering taxes. So for them to spend more to get us out of this recession, they're going to have to borrow. And we're going to say they're going to borrow from the banks. Remember, your loanable funds graph, let's just use this one. Your loanable funds graph is what we call money in the banks. That's the way we want to look at it. So you should know this very clear, because crowding out is what's going on here. Anytime we're in a recession, the government wants to spend more to get us out of this recession. When they do, they have to borrow from the banks. So when they borrow, they're taking money out of the banks. And I'm a supply of loanable funds guy, so that's the first thing I'm going to think is the government's borrowing, or anytime the government is spending, they have to be borrowing from the banks. So supply of loanable funds shifts to the left. We can see it shifting to the left here, and it's going to drive up that real interest rate. Supply of loanable funds would decrease or shift to the left. Now, here's the tricky thing about loanable funds, is you could answer this question when the government is spending, what's happening to the real interest rate. We see that the real interest rate is going up in both of these scenarios. But you could have shown this graph. When they ask you to draw the graph, you could have either shown a supply of loanable funds decreasing, which drives up the real interest rate, or you could have understood that when the government walks into the banks and says, I need $1 billion, that's got to be increasing the demand for loanable funds. And then when the money comes out, it shifts the supply of loanable funds to the left. Both of these are going on at the same time. So we should just know that either one of these is perfectly acceptable for you to sort of show when they say draw a correctly labeled graph. Either one of these is acceptable for explaining why expansionary fiscal policy is going to jack up, raise that real interest rate. So both of these are acceptable. I would choose one and I'm a supply guy when it comes to the government taking government spending. But lots of people are demand people, and they think of it in that way first. And then if they need to show this one, they just make the interest rate. They shift the supply of loanable funds to the left and make sure the interest rate's doing what it's supposed to do. Easy enough. We're not going to go into the effects of expansionary policy because you should have already done that. And I just want to talk about loanable funds. Obviously, if it's contractionary fiscal policy, government spending is going down or taxes are going up. The government is not borrowing. That's how we want to think of it. So that means there's less demand for loanable funds, right? If there's less demand, we know it's driving down the real interest rate. That also means there's going to be more money in the banks, also driving down the real interest rate. Know how to do contractionary and expansionary fiscal policy and loanable funds. It's a small piece, but you're going to see it no matter what. It's always on the test, so no way to get away from it. Let's look at a couple of these FRQ questions and see if we can see how they're tested on the FRQs. Government reduces the national debt. Draw a correctly labeled graph of the loanable funds market and show the effect of fiscal. So to reduce the national debt, you should know that government spending needs to go down. If we want the money the government owes to people, they've got to start spending less or increase their taxes. Either one of this would have done, but it's going to do the same thing to our loanable funds graph. If the government is spending less, again, this is contractionary fiscal policy, or they're increasing taxes, there's going to be more money in the banks. The government is taking less money out of the banks because they're spending less or borrowing less from the banks. This has got to drive down the real interest rate. Again, you better know, let's make sure we do our correctly labeled graph here, RIR, QLF. Make sure you label all axes, right? We can see that there's going to be more money in there because the government's taking less out. IR1, IR2, QLF1, QLF2. If you leave these QLFs or the IR or the RIR or the QLF here, if you don't label something, they'll take a point from you. It'd be a shame to know what you're doing and then just lose a point because you didn't label everything correctly. Obviously, if the government is spending less, they're borrowing less. If they're borrowing less, the demand for loanable funds has to be decreasing, driving down that real interest rate. IR1, IR2, again. Don't worry so much about this whole understanding of QLF decreasing or increasing. Don't worry so much about that. You're never going to be asked about it. But you are always asked about the real interest rate. And then we just make sure we label everything correctly so we get all our points. So, inflationary gap, and the government decreases government spending or increases taxes to close the gap. Again, same scenario over here going on with that supply. If the government is spending less or increasing taxes, we've got either one of these two. You don't need to draw them both. Just choose one that you like and stick with it and draw it. Expansionary fiscal policy is the opposite, right? Currently operating below full employment. We're in a recession, and show the effect of fiscal policy action on the equilibrium real interest rate. Government must be spending more because we're in a recession. If the government is spending, my question to you would be, where are they getting their money from? And you're going to say, Charles, they're getting their money from the banks. They're never taking in enough as taxes. That's not a good understanding. They're going to have to borrow. And we know that what the government is going to do is going to sell bonds. But you and I don't want to talk about bonds at this because it's confusing, because when we get to monetary policy, bonds are all over the place and we got to know bonds. We just need to understand that for the government to spend more, it's got to borrow from the banks. That's going to take money out of the banks, and that's going to drive up the interest rate. IR1, IR2, again, QLF, QLF. Let's just show those arrows showing everything changing. Again, that expansionary policy, I'm always a supply of loanable funds when the government is spending. So I know the interest rate's going up. So to do that with the demand for loanable funds, I don't really think about it. I just want to make that interest rate go in the way I need it to go, and that is up. Every so often, most of the time, they're going to let you choose which graph you draw. And they're just going to say, draw a correctly labeled graph of loanable funds, showing what happens when there's expansionary fiscal policy. Easy enough. But every so often, they're going to say, show what happens to supply or demand. Again, you just want to show it. Make sure you're doing it here correctly. We're good, I think, if that makes sense. Let's read some of these just to make sure we understand what's going on. Understand that if a budget deficit is increasing, it implies government spending is greater than tax revenue, which we should just always assume it is. Therefore, that would increase the deficit. My short answer here is anytime there's a budget deficit increase, I know government spending had to go up. And now we're back to that scenario. All right, how does an increase in Japan's government budget deficit affect each of the following? Real interest rates in the short run are what we're interested in. Same scenario, budget deficits going up. An increase in a budget deficit means that the government is spending more than tax revenue. That would give you a deficit. We're currently operating below full employment, recession. The U.S. government increases spending. There we are, back to spending. I think we're good. And look, they even say the U.S. government increases spending on goods and services by $100 billion, which is financed by borrowing. So that's that borrowing from the banks or from the loanable funds graph that we're talking about. Assume the increase in military spending is financed through government borrowing. Assume the U.S. economy enters into recession. Show the increased government spending on the real interest rate. There's a lot of these. Assume the government funded this increase in expenditure by borrowing from the public. Assume the increase in government spending increases the budget deficit. Again, there we see budget deficits are going up, therefore government spending had to be going up. And we're back to our graph. Show the effect of an increase in deficit spending. They don't have to say budget deficits. They can just say deficit spending. No, that means government spending going up. Government spending, explain how the policy would affect short-term interest rates. Done. Identify a fiscal policy that might be implemented to offset the effects of a decrease in investment. This is just a complicated sentence to know that if investment's going down, we're falling into a recession, probably, and the government can spend more or tax less, that's going to give us that expansionary fiscal policy, And we know that as soon as the government is spending, we know that that supply of loanable funds has to be decreasing. They're taking money out of the banks, and that's going to drive up the interest rate. You should draw this 10 or 20 times until you know it really well, and you can do it super fast. You shouldn't have to be thinking about these on the exam. QLF1, QLF2, show some arrows. Easy enough. All right. Explain how this increase in government spending. Okay, I think we're done with that. Obviously, this is expansionary monetary policy too. Oh, monetary policy. Sorry, I read that wrong. Let's look at a quick cheat sheet on monetary policy, see if we can make sense of it. This one's fairly straightforward, a little more straightforward than fiscal policy. If you have expansionary monetary policy, and that's with limited reserves. To tell you the truth, at this point in the game, I don't really know what's going on with ample reserves and loanable funds. I don't know if we'll be asked about loanable funds if we're talking about ample. If we are at this moment, I would just answer the same. But we have limited reserves. The whole Fed or central bank thing is they're going to buy bonds, they're going to lower the RRR, they're going to lower the discount rate. All of this would put more money in the system. Well, if there's more money in the system, there's more money supply, which we know this is all expansionary. It's going to increase the money supply. That means there's more money in the banks. And if there's more money in the banks, you can either show that supply of loanable funds shifting to the right, which will drive down the real interest rate. Or we can recognize if there's more money in the system, that also must imply that there's got to be less people, relatively, taking money out of the banks, or there's less demand. Notice what's important here is showing that real interest rate going down, right? So if the more money in the system implies more supply of loanable funds, or you could have also shown demand for loanable funds shifting to the right. Contractionary policies, obviously the opposite, right? To be contractionary, the Fed or the central bank will sell bonds. They'll raise the RRR or they'll raise the discount rate. When they do that, the money supply is going to go down. That's less money in the system. Supply of loanable funds shifts to the left, decreases, driving up that real interest rate. We also recognize that if there's less money in the system, there's going to be a higher demand for that money, which is going to end up driving up the real interest rate. So both of these, again, are acceptable for monetary policy. I would choose one and then just make sure you can do the other one if asked. All right, let's again go back to the FRQs, make sure we understand what's going on here. Expansionary, we know the money supply is going up. That's where we're going to start. Assume the central bank of Rankin-Lin pursues an expansionary monetary policy. What happens to the real interest rate? Well, you and I should be able just to show that if there's more money in the system, the money supply has increased. Supply of loanable funds shifts to the right. And we know that that's going to drive down the real interest rate, IR1, IR2. Don't forget the RIR. It is bankers, and bankers care about the real interest rate. Quantity of loanable funds, cool. Soon as policy action aimed to offset the effects of a decrease in investment. Fiscal policy, this is in the wrong place. This is fiscal policy. That should not be here. No big deal. Contractionary monetary policy. The central bank of Seoul sells bonds. What effect of the central bank's action on the following? As soon as they said real interest rate, anytime anybody says real interest rate, you're thinking loanable funds, because that is our loanable funds graph. It is about the real interest rate. So even though they didn't say loanable funds, they said real interest rate, and I know what's going on here. So they're selling bonds. That means less money. Money supply is going down. Supply of loanable funds decreases in the banks, driving up the real interest rate. So again, we just have to know how to draw it. We should be able to do it really quickly. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be readable. Maybe not like mine. All right. Let's talk about automatic stabilizers. You guys should have done this in fiscal policy. If there, government transfer payments, this is for some reason a big thing right now. I keep having people want to talk to me about transfer payments. I'm not quite sure why. It isn't tested very heavily, but it is tested. So we do have to know it. But automatic stabilizers are usually taught in your fiscal policy thing. They happen immediately. If we fall into a recession, what we think of is transfer payments are going to increase. Well, transfer payments are paid by the government, right? We think in unemployment benefits, we're thinking welfare benefits, Social Security. If we start falling into a recession, unemployment and welfare benefits are going to kick up because people are losing their jobs. If transfer payments are going up, you just have to know government spending just went up. This is more of a fiscal policy thing, but we should just talk about it. Anyway, more government spending, we've already done what happens when there's more fiscal policy. Tax credits. Think of tax credits as subsidies to businesses. Assume businesses are granted a tax credit on spending. Well, on machinery, so on investment. They're going to be given the money or they're getting subsidies as long as they're buying machinery. Let's think of it. So if they're going to spend $1 million and the government's going to give them $1 million back, you can be pretty sure they're going to actually take out a loan to buy that machinery because they know the government's going to hand them money as soon as they do it, or at least at the end of the year. So just recognize that if the government is subsidizing machinery buying, we implies that the demand for loanable funds are going to increase. Lots of businesses are going to be willing to take out loans, and that's going to drive up that interest rate. Don't forget the RIR and the quantity of loanable funds. So a little more complicated is this capital flow stuff, but not much. There are a lot of loanable funds questions on capital flows. A lot more than this. There's a good dozen or more. It's asked quite a bit. So I think we're going to save that. And this will be under the foreign exchange question. If you see a video or you want to look at the video on foreign exchange, we'll talk more about loanable funds. I don't want to throw it into the middle of this because it's a bit confusing. We could do it real quick. It's pretty easy. All right, let's just talk about capital flows. The idea here is, let's say I have US and I have Japan, and let's use real interest rates. The US has a real interest rate of 8%, whereas Japan has a real interest rate of 2%. Well, my question to you would be, who's going to put whose money in whose banks? And we got our big foreign exchange in the sky. And would Japanese be more interested in putting their money into U.S. banks or their own banks to make that 8 or 2%? And your answer should be, Charles, the Japanese are going to dump their yen into the Forex because they want that 8% that's being paid in U.S. banks. So they drop their yen into the Forex, and they're going to buy U.S. dollars in the foreign exchange market because they want to put those dollars into our U.S. banks to get that high real interest rate. This is what we call a capital inflow. Money's flowing in, chasing these higher interest rates. So if money's flowing into the banks, it's got to go somewhere. It's got to go into the banks. We know the supply of loanable funds is increasing, and that is going to lower the real interest rate in the U.S. Now, we got to make sure we know what we're talking about here. This is in the U.S. So interest rates are going down, IR1, IR2, and money's coming into the country, QLF, 1 and 2. Easy enough. If we had to do the Japanese side, we can see that there's what we call a capital outflow, and you need to know both sides, by the way. Money's leaving Japan, so that means money has to be coming out of the banks. We can just simply understand that the supply of loanable funds in Japan, right, has to be decreasing as that money's leaving Japan and flowing toward those higher interest rates in the U.S. So supply of loanable funds decreases, driving up the real interest rate, yada, yada. Same scenario. All right, my friends, that was very quick and dirty for loanable funds. You can see it kind of jumps all over the place, but work at it. Keep doing your best. You're doing great. All right, my friends, be safe. Take care.